Okay, how many of you have ever been in a car? Guessing the vast majority of you, probably all. Most of you have probably driven a car too, right? But how many of you have ever raced a car before? That's another question. Maybe you've been go-karting once or twice. I have been racing since about 2010 in one form or another, and it's the most exhilarating, the most scary, and the most fun thing that I've ever done, quite frankly. And I believe that there's no more exciting and adrenaline-filled form of motor racing than Formula One. Just right on the left here with the new colours. Formula One, most people don't really give it a second thought. They're like, oh, it's that European version of NASCAR. But it does apply to you more than you would think, due to its technological innovations. In fact, Mercedes, which is shown on the left, uses something called cross-pollination, in which engineers transfer from the road to the race division and back so they can learn from one another. This proves that Formula One engineers have a great impact on what is in your everyday car. Now, there are three main things, or to me, my favorite three things about Formula One that have transferred into road cars are their structure, their engines, and their aerodynamics. So without further ado, structure. A big part of structure in Formula One is safety. Now, this may look bad, but surprisingly, that guy actually escaped without any major injuries. This is because Formula One currently is an extremely safe sport. There have been no deaths in the last 20 years. Sorry, one death in the last 20 years. This is in stark contrast to when motor racing began. The first motor racing death was in 1894, or it was in 1898 after the first race actually occurring in 1894. And a curious thing happened in Formula One in the next 100 or so years, or rather racing in general, where the tracks stayed the same, the safety methods remained archaic, but the cars got incredibly fast and people ended up doing this, but with no hospitals or ambulances to save them. The current Formula One car, which is basically this, according to David Burgess-Wise, is about 80 pounds in its weight, in its chassis, yet it can withstand a crash test much, much more vigorous than your everyday road car. Now, after safety in terms of structure, there is active suspension. Active suspension was pioneered by the Lotus 99T in the late 1980s. And active suspension is not exactly what you would think when you think of suspension. What most cars use is something called reactive suspension, which is there's a bump in the road, the car absorbs the shock, but active suspension is more of a proactive approach. Active suspension was actually outlawed in the mid 1990s because it gave cars an unfair competitive advantage. So the FIA, which is the governing body behind Formula One, just said that they can't use it anymore, quite frankly. And according to ArsTechnica.com, there is currently a manufacturer producing active suspension models for racing cars available worldwide. And although it's not in road cars quite yet, it will be due to the fact that Ars Technica states it improves performance, reduces driver fatigue, and increases tire longevity. According to Csaba Csere of Car and Driver, road cars are not yet using active suspension, but there is a company in Massachusetts that's working on it right now. Finally, in regards to structure, there is the body. All Formula One bodies are made of something called carbon fiber, which is a lightweight composite material that's extremely strong. This is also used in most supercars like Ferraris, Lamborghinis, stuff like that, but it is yet to be used in road cars. Road cars, however, will be using it, and it's predicted to be the next big thing in road car technology. This is because it will be mass-produced. It's already starting, if anyone's ever seen a BMW i4 or an i8. Those very futuristic-looking cars, they use carbon fiber to make them extremely light and thus more environmentally friendly with less power. So what would a car be without an engine? Presumably not much, probably little more than a horse-drawn carriage. Formula One engines are actually currently called power units because they are hybrids. They rely on about 160 horsepower of electronic technology with about 600 horsepower of a small turbocharged engine. Turbochargers are the main content of this slide, and to understand turbochargers you have to understand what a supercharger is. A supercharger is a mechanism by which compressed air is injected into the cylinder head. This basically creates a higher power output and a bit of a whine in the engine. This is an ERA R3A. If you ever watch a video of these on YouTube, then they whine a bit. That's actually my dad in the car, if anyone's interested. I think it's a pretty cool picture. But then the superchargers turned out in the late 1920s to be very effective. Something called the Blower Bentley was created in 1929 off a 1928 model Bentley, which won Le Mans, in order to win the competition again the next year. The Blower Bentley utilized a supercharger, and from the previous year, the power output increased from 120 to 240 horsepower, which is quite a lot considering that all you have is supercharger. After superchargers, the natural progression was to include turbochargers, which are essentially the same thing except with compressed exhaust gas included with them, which creates even more power. Although Formula One didn't pioneer turbochargers in the late 1980s, there was something called the turbo era that was ushered in, and cars were creating upwards of 1,100 horsepower, which, if you know anything about cars, is quite a lot. The turbo era was brought to an end due to FIA regulations because the cars were too fast and too dangerous. SAE International Journal of Engines states that turbochargers are being brought back in production vehicles. An Indian company called Tata has discovered that without increasing emissions, turbochargers can increase an engine's power output by about 40%. This means that you can have essentially a 40% smaller engine producing the same amount of power with no increase in emissions, which will be utilized in future technology. Currently, as I said, Formula One relies not on engines but on power units. If anyone's ever heard of the Ferrari or the LaFerrari, the Porsche 918, or the McLaren P1, these all rely on a similar technology, aka really high-powered hybrids. Lastly is my favorite thing, aerodynamics. I want to be an aerodynamicist in F1, so I'm a little biased in this regard. Aerodynamics never used to be a big thing in production cars, but now it's becoming increasingly looked at because of Formula One, because of the great impact that it has. The first real interest in aerodynamics in Formula One took place in the late 1960s, where, as you can see here, they included these things called inverted wings. This is a very rudimentary version, which are essentially an upside-down airplane wing. They do exactly the opposite. They, instead of lifting the car up, they push it against the ground, giving the tires more traction. The next big thing was ground effect, which is shown here in a Lotus 78. Ground effect was, according to David Burgess-Wise, discovered in 1977 with this car. It won the World Championship in 1979 and was banned in 1980, as with many great technologies, because it was simply just too fast for the other cars. The Lotus 78, according to the film The Greatest Innovations in Formula One, which, if anyone's interested in researching this more, I would encourage you watching this on YouTube, is the main reason that modern-day cars have spoilers, because of its great impact in aerodynamics. So overall, Formula One would not exist without the funding of road cars, and this means that Formula One has to be useful in some way to road cars, and in turn to all of you. And road cars would not be what they are without Formula One. So Formula One is essentially a research university for road cars, and it's quite an incredible sport, and the roads and the cars of today would not be what they are without this sport.